So the cases that I chose for this case comparison are OCT versus Renn, which happened in January 31st, 2017, and OCT versus Kalarus, which happened March 10th, 2017. And I chose these cases because, first off, OCT versus Renn contains an extremely serious allegation against a teacher, which was of sexual abuse, which is one of the issues, I think, that when teachers are found guilty of that, really misrepresents teachers and the integrity of the profession. So I chose this case because I wanted to know what the implications were for the teacher who was found guilty of this and what the consequences are, because you kind of hear in the media about teachers who are guilty of this, but I never really hear the end result or what happens after the initial allegations. As teachers, we have the duty to care, and this case obviously violated this, so I was very interested in knowing the severity of the discipline for Renn. And I chose OCT versus Kalarus because, first off, it was about a teacher's slander of another colleague. And this is one thing before I started this program that I didn't know was actually outlined in OCT regulations or policy. It also involves the emotional and psychological abuse of a student. So this is a teacher who affected his school community in two different ways or two different aspects. So I was interested to know how OCT dealt with this in a legal matter. And I think it really highlights what can happen when teachers either lose their temper or have outbursts. And it really just highlights the fact that as teachers, we need to be constantly aware of what it is that we're saying, and how we are behaving towards our colleagues and our students. And I was very interested to know what happens when we don't behave in that way. These cases are very significant to me as an Ontario teacher because they highlight the importance of professional conduct, but also the severity of the discipline when these standards are not met. So OCT versus Renn shows what happens when teachers are entrusted with the care of a child, but when they do not meet that obligation. And OCT versus Kalarus does this in a similar way, and highlights why as teachers we need to always be thinking about what it is we're saying and what we're doing, and what happens when we fail to live up to the professional standards set out by OCT. Being professional and ethical are really at the core of being an Ontario teacher. So these cases both highlight why these are so important and what happens when we fail to live up to those standards. So this is very significant, especially as a new teacher coming into the system, to know how highly professionalism and ethical standards are held through OCT. So in terms of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, arguably both teachers could say that they were expressing their freedom of belief, expressing their freedom of thought, and their freedom of expression, which is found in Section 2B of the Charter, because Kalarus was just talking to a student in the way that he wanted to, or the way that he wanted to express himself. However, the derogatory comment that he made immediately is contrasted with Section 1 of the Charter, which states that this freedom of thought, belief, and expression is subject only to reasonable limits. So Kalarus was not able to live up to the standards set out by the Charter and violated this Charter of Rights and Freedoms because abusing a student is not within reasonable limits of freedom of thought, belief, and expression. Renn similarly could argue that he was just thinking what he was allowed to think about a student or expressing himself towards a student the way that he wanted to. Again, however, this gets contrasted with Section 1, because this is not a reasonable limit. He was abusing a student sexually, he was making a student feel uncomfortable, and he should not have been thinking about students in that way, nor acting upon that thought. So both of these teachers are in violation of the Charters and Rights and Freedoms of Section 2B, as determined by Section 1. In addition, both teachers are also guilty of violating the Education Act. So Kalarus's legal implication by the Education Act is that it's found in Section 264(1), and that teachers are supposed to maintain proper order and discipline in the teacher's classroom and while on duty in the school ground and in the schoolyard. Sorry. So because Kalarus was trying to get a student down from the fence, he was trying to maintain discipline, but did not do so in a proper way, because he was yelling negative comments at a student, insulting students, in order to get his end result. So this is not maintaining proper discipline, and this is not living up to the education standards set out by the Education Act. Following this, Section 264(2)(3) says that teachers are responsible for maintaining a healthy physical, emotional, and social learning environment, which Kalarus is obviously not doing because he insulted a teacher behind their back and also insulted his students. So he is not contributing to a healthy school environment in two different ways and is really being kind of a negative force in the school, both with his colleagues and with his students. In the Education Act for Renn, however, Section 263 says that the termination of the teacher is warranted when it affects the welfare of the school. So, obviously, because Renn was sexually abusing his student, that his termination was extremely warranted because he did not contribute to a positive school environment, similar to Kalarus. However, his was on a grander scale, allowing for his position to be terminated and for his license to be revoked, which falls under the OCT Act, under Section 30.2, that says the discipline committee finding a member guilty of committing an act of professional conduct may revoke their certificate of qualification, which just explains why Renn had his license taken away, and is also guilty of professional misconduct, Regulation 437, 7.3, of abusing a student sexually. Similar to Kalarus, who's also found guilty under this regulation, however, of abusing a student psychologically and emotionally. So both teachers are in violation of professional misconduct. This resulted in certificate of qualification being revoked for Renn. However, for Kalarus, this just resulted in a 2-day unpaid suspension and reprimand by his peers. So two similar cases, however, on two different scales. Finally, the Child and Family Services Act, Kalarus is found has legal implications under because he inflicted the abuse of a child, verbally, psychologically, and emotionally. Renn is also found guilty of this, but sexually, as well as psychologically and emotionally. However, for Renn, the Children's Aid Society did have to get involved because under Section 3B, they have to protect children where necessary. And because Renn posed a threat to an entire school, not just one student, they really had to get involved because they had to make sure that no other students were a victim of Renn's actions, and they had to make sure that he was removed for the welfare of the school. So the relations to this course, as per the decisions made by the court, in terms of the case itself, OCT versus Kalarus relates to the case we studied about Mr. Sloan and Mr. Tate, because that involves the slander of another teacher. Mr. Sloan was making inappropriate comments about Mr. Tate, making him unprofessional in the eyes of OCT, which goes against professional ethical standards. So Mr. Sloan was suspended during that investigation. Mr. Kalarus was suspended for 2 days and reprimanded by his peers, which shows a similar outcome in a decision. However, Kalarus is also responsible for abusing students, not just talking slander about another teacher. However, similar actions kind of in their roots and in their implications. The Renn case, however, really relates to the CAS webinar that we watched and holds a lot of relevance for this. This webinar outlines the steps that would have to be taken by the Children's Aid Society to get involved and allows us to understand how the outcome of this case came to be. So the duty to report policy allows us to see that another teacher or staff may have reported him to CAS because they saw warning signs or red flags, and tells us that a child under Renn's care was not being cared for properly. So this webinar really allows us to see kind of the background steps that we didn't see in reading about Renn's case, and really allows us to see why CAS got involved and why this is so important. So both of these cases really have similar issues present in them, or similar violations of the different Education Acts, OCT Act, Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Child and Family Services Act. However, they are done on two different scales. For example, Renn got terminated in the end. However, Kalarus only got a 2-day suspension, but both of these cases really help to highlight why it is so important to be professional as a teacher, and really that we cannot violate our duty to care found in our textbook, because our number one job is really that we are in charge of students and in charge of children, and that we really have to take that job seriously. And these cases really highlight that what happens when, teachers kind of stray or go awry. So these cases were very interesting for me as an Ontario teacher, and I would be very interested in looking at more cases such as these.